So today what we're going to be looking at is basically what most people colloquially refer to as the baby Grand Seiko, the Sarb033, versus an actual Grand Seiko. There are a little bit of differences between the two. The Grand Seiko that I have is a quartz model. I personally am okay with the quartz factor of it, but it's something to keep in mind throughout the review. And I apologize if the video runs a little lengthily, but hope you enjoy. So let's get into this battle / comparison / why spend so much more on a Grand Seiko. So let's get some general dimensions out of the way. By my calipers, the Sarb measures 38.5 in diameter, about 44.3 lug to lug, and 11.5 thick with a 20 millimeter lug width. For the Grand Seiko, we have a width of about 36.8, 43.8 lug to lug, and about 9.7 millimeters thick. So in comparison to each other, the Grand Seiko is about 1.5 millimeters shorter in diameter. It is about 1 millimeter shorter in lug to lug distance, and close to 2 millimeters thinner overall, which I think if we look at the two side profiles here, you can definitely tell that Sarb is a little bit thick. So starting off with the dials of these two watches, you can definitely tell there's a lot of shared design language. They both have these Dauphine style hands. They both have simple stick type markers. They both have the date at 3, which is framed. One main difference I see is that the Grand Seiko has its minute track printed directly onto the dial, while the Seiko has its minute track, which is also subdivided into smaller intervals on the chapter ring portion of the watch, while the Grand Seiko keeps that portion just very low and polished. The Seiko mainly has all polished indices, while the Grand Seiko has indices which are polished on the sides of the raised markers, multifaceted raised markers at that, and actually striated and I guess brushed in the very top portion of that marker. You'll be able to see it better on a macro level when we go to that later. On the Seiko here, you see that we have these sword style hands with the only special kind of decoration being the fact that there is that center line that goes down the middle, which is actually kind of like, you can see it really well there, that like white center line that goes down the middle, which is actually kind of like not brushed, but almost it's almost like a blasted appearance to that center line portion. It's nice. It gives a kind of like linearity to the watch, a nice like continuity of pointing to the hour markers. And on the Grand Seiko, we actually have very finely brushed middle sections to the hands, and then as you can kind of tell in different lighting and different angles, the edges of the hands are very highly polished. Go out to a further angle here. They both kind of have a similar stance in the way their case looks from the top visually. And let's go to a macro of the dial so we can kind of really appreciate the difference in detail. As we can see with the Seiko, each marker has this type of raised portion, then middle valley to every single marker. It is very nice. They are all completely polished. We see on the very edges, there's loom pips within all of them. They seem fairly nicely lined. Not too much imperfections going on there. Nice applied Seiko logo. Here you can see better with the hands what I was talking about with the line going down the middle. See the loom applied in the middle of the hands there. Done very well, very cleanly. You see on the hour hand there actually is a speck inside of the loom. I don't know if that's missing loom or just a speck inside. Looks to be a speck, but overall fairly nice. You can see that the edges of the hands aren't completely well finished. They do have like some fuzziness around them, but yeah, overall well done there. The printing and writing on the dial, all very well done, all very clean, no real imperfections. Nice framing in the date window, but again, with the date window you can see there is some kind of like pitting almost, some fuzziness around the metal edges there. You see in the hour track, or the minute track rather, you can see in the minute track here that there's really no misprinting, all very nicely done. And overall, I mean, this is a watch that goes for around $400 new, and at a macro level like this, it really does hold up. The detail, the attention to detail is there. It looks very nice. Moving on to the Grand Seiko here, we see that again, we have this, we have multifaceted markers similar to what was on this Seiko, but as you can see, they have a little more dimensionality to them. They really do just rise off that dial. And you can see that each side there is very highly polished, catching lots of reflections, lots of light, while the very top, it has this very, very fine striation. As you can see there, it's not perfect. There are some little dusts or particles inside of that striation pattern. The Grand Seiko logo is actually done in this type of almost shiny, silvery type of font leathering that has kind of like tiny speckles within it. Very interesting, and as you can tell, it's actually mirrored there in those minute markers. You can see the same type of silvery, sparkly kind of application there. You can see the hands have very fine brushing on the tops, while the sides are actually slightly slanted as well as highly polished. If you look at that date window, there's not really as much of a pitting-like texture or fuzziness around it. It's actually pretty clean, pretty well done. It's all these details, like the fact that this silvery type of printing matches in the indices and the Grand Seiko logo. The fact that this is actually like a hand-finished watch, the dimensionality to those faceted markers, the fact that it's actually polished and then it has these crazy little striations in the middle of every single marker. It's just really cool, and there's a lot of tiny details that obviously aren't very apparent on first glance, but they come together with the watch to just create something that's more than the sum of its parts. Because of the striated top portions of each of those markers, it really, when it catches the light, stays in this kind of very metallic looking brushed state almost, and allows a lot of contrast between those highly brushed sides with that mirror finishing and the just regular tops of those markers, which is pretty cool. So moving on to the cases of the watch, I will, for right now, try to do my best attempt to show you what the difference is in Zaratsu polishing. So if I take the Seiko here and I put the polished bezel into the camera, you can kind of tell it fading in, fading away, and slightly distorting as it does so. You can see there the edge of it is very distorted, kind of blurry within the camera. And if we take the Grand Seiko here and do a similar kind of test with it, you can see that it literally shows the camera in pretty much a mirror-like form. There's not really as much distortion as there was on the Seiko. It's a lot clearer, it's a lot more like a mirror actually. And that is again hand finish. It's done by hand by someone who is trained in this type of art. So overall, I just think that's a really cool thing. It definitely does come to life when you're outside taking pictures, the way it's catching the light, the way it's actually reflecting the trees with more clarity, or reflecting, whatever your real surroundings are. You can definitely tell the difference. As I just kind of hold these two here like that, at least to my eyes through the viewfinder, and especially in real life, the Grand Seiko just looks a little bit more brilliant. It shines a little more. The Seiko by comparison looks a little duller. It's just the quality of finishing coming to life. And it's these small little details that make the price difference make sense, but it's also those details that you decide whether or not it's worth it for you to spring the extra amount of cash. So with the Seiko here, we see that it's almost like a multi-pieced case. It has this kind of center edge line down here through the middle, where this part bends towards it, this part bends away from it. We have it meet here in a very defined lug end. And it's interesting because it's almost like this brush section becomes literally another part that was just put on top of the watch. It's so distinctly another layer, and it's just very interesting. I've never seen like another finishing quite like this. We can see that that double layer is very well defined all the way through the end of the case. You have a pretty fine brushing on the top of the lugs, as you can see best there. We have this nice polished bezel, which kind of leads from the polished markers to the polished bezel to the rest of the case. Very prominent case back there, which makes the case a lot thicker. I think that's one reason the Grand Seiko is a little thicker. I mean, the Grand Seiko is a little slimmer because it doesn't have a see-through case back. We see when we go to the case back, we have a nice glimpse of the movement there. Not really highly decorated in any sense of the word, but sometimes it's nice to just look at what's, you know, operating with inside the watch. You have that signed Seiko S snake type looking symbol there. Non-screw down crown, but it does have hacking and hand winding and all those other bells and whistles. We have a fully brushed 3-piece oyster type style bracelet with the push button deployant. Opens up, very nicely done, pretty secure. As you can see there, there's a gap between the links and the bracelet. I haven't really ever caught anything on that, but it is there and it is pretty prominent. So it's something that could have been improved on. We have 2 holes of micro adjustment there, which are better than 0. And as you can see, we just have typical push pin links inside of the Seiko. But yeah, overall very sturdy bracelet. I liked how they went with a female end link, so that way it can actually conform to the wrist better, kind of just go straight down. The bracelet definitely does match the style of watch. Something I will say about this is the way that the case is multifaceted, the fact that it is so thick in a way, it does definitely make it seem more masculine, a little more rugged. But overall, I do like how curved that case is, because that actually comes, almost probably meets that case back there and allows it to actually sit and conform pretty well to the wrist. Moving on to the Grand Seiko, we again have that same almost polished bezel, brushed lug tops, polished sides. With this one, we don't have the same kind of faceted case in the middle. It's just more of a slim, streamlined case. We see that it has, again, pretty defined brushing on the top lugs. I mean, is it more defined and more fine than the Seiko is? I would say probably yes, but I mean, I'm not going to go down and analyze it or measure it or something such as that. But either way, both cases, pretty well done brushing. The nice thing about this Grand Seiko case is, as you can see, it has that polishing right there along the inside of the lug, as well as along the flank of the lug. So that actually acts in a way to almost slim out the lugs, as well as just provide more way for the watch to catch the light and just overall look good. We see by contrast with the Seiko that instead of just being a nice continuous kind of smooth arc down to conform to the wrist, it's very much almost flat up here and then geometrically angles down in a very stark manner. And I think it looks very nice. It helps to actually wear very well on the wrist. You can actually see that this lug end actually goes down lower than the case back does. So that ends up making it sit very, very closely to the wrist. So it's only about 9.5 millimeters thick, but it really does feel very, very thin on the wrist. Very, very comfortable. Really nicely done. As you can see, we have pierced lug holes where we didn't have that on the Seiko. As the case back, we don't have a see-through case back because most people who want quartz watches don't really care about how the quartz look. But granted, the Grand Seiko does really decorate their quartz watches very well. They do striping on them and it actually looks very nice. It's in a gold type of tone. Very, very cool. We have this nice emblazoned Grand Seiko lion on the back, some general information, and a similar 3-link style bracelet. The mid-links on this bracelet are actually a little bit thicker compared to the Seiko if I just bring them side to side. As you can see, these are actually all pretty similar in size, while these are very much definitely thinner on the edges and thicker in the middle, which is something interesting. We come to this nicely signed Grand Seiko clasp done in different finishings with kind of like the blasted background and the polished logo and outline, while the Seiko was just this regular Seiko. We have again a push button deployant. The click of the Grand Seiko does feel a lot tighter. The tolerances are obviously probably a little bit better, but you know, very similar clasp styles. Again, interestingly enough, with this Grand Seiko, there is a little bit of a gap between this closure mechanism and the end links. It is not as big of a gap as there was on the Seiko. If I just bring it in really quick, As you can see, the gap on the Seiko is a little bit more defined, a little higher off the wrist, so it has a higher chance of catching something versus the Grand Seiko. But again, I've never really caught anything on that Seiko clasp. Interestingly enough, the Seiko does not have any micro adjustment, while the Seiko actually has 2 holes, which I would have liked to at least see 1 or 2 holes on this. I mean, it's a very, very small clasp, which is nice, but micro adjustment is always great. We see we have actual screws for the end links versus pins for the Seiko. And just overall, the fluidity of the bracelet, the quality of construction, how solid it feels, it does have a higher quality than the Seiko bracelet, more sturdy, more well built. Obviously, that's not something I can really project through the screen, but just take my word for it. The Grand Seiko really just took the Seiko design, or vice versa, but the Grand Seiko has refined it. It's made it slimmer. It's made it shorter lug to lug. It's made it more comfortable to wear. It's made it just very much more eye-catching. One thing I do think I like about the Seiko more is the fact that it has female end links. The male end links don't hinder the Grand Seiko too much because of the fact that it already has a very short lug to lug length. But even then, I would have probably preferred female end links. Moving on to how the watches wear. Earlier, I was wearing my vintage Rolex. So here's the Grand Seiko on my 6.5 inch wrist. It is nowhere near being too big. As you can see, it really does conform to the wrist. You can see the way those lugs angle down, it just literally wants to hug the wrist. And overall, it is a supremely comfortable watch. It is a great size. It is not too flashy. The fact that it has a black dial is almost a way for the rest of the finishing and just the execution of everything else to shine. Yeah, overall, wears very nicely, wears very slimly, and I have no complaints about the way it wears, minus the fact that it would be nice if it had micro adjustment on the clasp. And here is the Seiko on my 6.5 inch wrist. Now, visually, the watch is a little larger. Personally, the way I feel about this watch is, again, the case is a little beefier, and then it thins down into this bracelet, which I think almost in a way looks too small for the rest of the watch. That's just how I think about it visually. It just looks a little almost awkward in a way. But again, very nice case. It has a very similar type of slimming lug look to it. Although it doesn't necessarily conform perfectly to the level that the Grand Seiko does, as the lugs don't necessarily come down below the case back, it still is a very comfortable watch to wear. Again, nowhere near being too big for my wrist. Very nicely done. I put both watches on the wrist because why not? You can kind of tell that the Grand Seiko almost has a different color about it. It looks almost a little warmer. It has a bracelet which I feel like, because of the middle links, actually looks a little more proportionate. That may be what's throwing me off on the Seiko, the fact that the mid links are so small that it makes it look improportional. With the Grand Seiko, the mid links actually tie into the watch design a little better, I think. And you can tell there the kind of slimness profile of it. The Grand Seiko obviously wearing a little slimmer, but yeah, both great watches. So both watches have their pros and cons. Obviously, the biggest barrier of entry will be the price. The Grand Seiko retails for around $2,000 new. On the used market, you can find them between 12 and maybe 18-ish, depending on condition and just then how nice the seller is. And the Sarb is around like the $300 to $400 mark. So basically, the Sarb's a lot easier to palette, a lot easier for the wallet, and because it fits in that kind of dressy everyday category, it may not be a watch that a lot of people who are used to wearing dive watches, used to wearing sports watches, they might not gravitate it towards it the most. And for $300, it's a killer watch. You can be used as an everyday watch. Again, it can be used on those dressier occasions, but the Grand Seiko is definitely just for that person who, one, is obviously okay with spending that extra money, two, okay with spending that extra money on a quartz watch, and three, is just kind of obsessed with the quality, the attention to detail, that kind of crazy person who wants to take a loop to the watches just to see how finely done it is. Obviously, there's no contest. The Grand Seiko looks better. It is finished to a higher standard. The bracelet's better. The polishing is better. It's an overall better package. It fits better on the wrist as well. But is that $1,600 difference worth it to you? It's a almost incremental change for some, you know. Why go with the Grand Seiko if the Sarb can do everything the Grand Seiko can, basically? And I can't argue with that. But in the end, it's just whatever grabs you. Do you want the ridiculously overbuilt nature, the over-designed nature, the overly executed nature of the Grand Seiko, or do you want the reliability, the dependability, the affordability of the Seiko? I mean, it's really up to you. They're both great watches. Hope I was able to get something across in this video. Thanks for watching.